I think we are ready to start. I'm Philippe van Geel, Secretary General of AVERE. I will moderate this webinar from today. Short introduction. AVERE is a non-profit association promoting e-mobility through different stakeholders. We have a very different kind of memberships, going from industry associations to EV owner associations. This gives us the right opportunity to address the needs from both parties. In this webinar, you can submit your questions in the Q&A. There is also possibility to upvote for these questions. These questions will be handled at the end of the webinar. During the webinar, we also have some polls to understand the point of view of all the attendees. So please, welcome to participate. We are really interested in your feedback on this. This webinar is also recorded and will be available afterwards. Now I will give you the words to Jason Dunn. He's our policy manager with AVERE, and he will handle the topic of this webinar, the AFID. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philippe. Yes, and thank you again, everybody, for joining the call, for the webinar. As Philippe said, I'm going to take you through the revision of the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive. I see there's a very diverse amount of people in the webinar, so I'm really going to go from very basics, how EU policy is made, up until the very contentious issues that we find will be at the center of the debate of the revision of the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive. So really how EU legislative process is made. The Commission really submits the first proposal, and if you can see at the bottom underneath the different headings, I've provided you with an example of the original Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive that was previously debated and discussed in 2013-2014. So the Commission proposal proposes the initial legislation. There's then a first reading in the European Parliament, who discuss it internally. The Council also has the rights to legislate in this regard. As you can see, the AFID only took 2 readings within the Council and the Parliament. But if there is no agreement at these 2 stages, they also have the chance within the Parliament again with amendments to discuss the file again, and the same thing in the Council. The final act was actually signed back in 2014 in October, and then it was adopted in the same month. I think the key aspect here to understand is the AFID was a directive. So a directive establishes the end results to be achieved in every member state, but it's up to the national governments as to how to adapt the national laws. The other main piece of legislation is that you can really adopt through this procedure is a regulation. And a regulation is kind of like a ceiling to it that the member states have to reach when implementing it in the national legislation. So it's let's say a higher threshold to reach. And that's key to keep in mind when we're discussing the AFIDs. And then just to understand that it was published in the Official Journal of 2014, but it really started in January 2013. So that really gives you kind of sense of how long it takes to adapt and essentially go through the whole legislative. So what was included in the original AFIDs, it set out minimum requirements for the deployment of alternative fuels infrastructure in public environments. So not only electricity, but hydrogen, CNG, and LNG. For the purpose of this webinar, we are only going to focus on electricity rather than the other types of alternative fuels. With regards to EV charging points, it really only mandated in 2020 we had to ensure that you could circulate urban and suburban, so urbans, and were appropriate within networks. So when you think about it now, where we are in 2020, you get a better understanding of why, let's say, charging infrastructure is more developed in cities rather than in rural and along major highways, because member states didn't really have that, weren't expected to put that charging infrastructure there. And as an indication, the amount of recharging points had to be 110 electric cars. This is actually quite key. It was never a binding target to have member states have that ratio of 1 charging point per 10 electric cars. This was just an indication within the preamble of the legislation. And so why are we now thinking of the revision of this directive? It's because it was within the original legislation to review the implementation of this directive and as appropriate submit the proposal. But as we now speaking with legislators, speaking with the European Commission, that within at least the Green Deal, that it's not going to come until 2021. So what is an alternative fuel? Anything that had the potential to decarbonize the transport sector. Again, it included electricity, hydrogen, biofuels, LNG, LPG, and then charging speeds. So a recharging point was, and again, anything that charges 1 electric vehicle at a time. And a normal power recharging point is power less than or equal to 22 kilowatts, whereas a high power charging point was power of more than 22 kilowatts. And really what I'm trying to get to explain here with this visual at the bottom is that when you think about it, 3 kilowatts at home, you can charge your car in, let's say, 11 hours, whereas 7 to 22, you can charge it in, let's say, 8 up to 4 hours at 22. But this is what they originally had seen. They weren't really foreseeing such development of the market with the rapid and high power at time. And then transparency, when thinking about how transparent charging access needed to be, you had to allow the public to charge on an ad hoc basis. So this means without a contract, like a telecom company with your phone, you had to have an ad hoc contract rather than a contract directly with them. And you had to ensure that the prices were reasonable, easily and clearly comparable, transparent, and non-discriminatory. Whether that is like that today, we will actually go into that. And now the poll number 1. Philippe, if you could press the poll. So yeah, do you feel as if there is sufficient EV charging infrastructure in your member state, or where you are at least taking the call from today? This is really to get an understanding of where you think infrastructure rollout is currently. I already see there's some questions. We can disseminate the PDF of the presentation at the end. So Philippe, do we have sufficient amount of people for the poll?
Yes, take a few seconds more and then we will share it with you. Here we go. I will end the poll now and share the results.
So, I mean, the results are pretty obvious. 82% think no, 18% think yes. I mean, the market is quite diverse today, and we'll go into that just actually right now to see. But yes, generally, this is again why we feel at least there needs to be a revision of the AFIDs. Okay, so currently now today, where are we with the amount of public charges and EVs across Europe? I have to say thank you to Transport and Environment for this nice graph that they made. Basically, what I want to show here, that's, you have Belgium, even Cyprus at 1 in 10 EVs, 1 charging point per 10 EVs. Netherlands here as well has 5 EVs per charging point, and then the EU is right here. What's important to understand here as well is that while Cyprus might have that meet that ratio, they obviously have less people within their country, as regards instead of in comparing with Great Britain or Belgium or any of the other countries. So yeah, again, now we have the Green Deal. We have that aim to reduce greenhouse gases in transport by 2050. We have the target of 1 million charging points by 2025. Sorry. And where are we today? This graph on the left is from IAFO. This is at least from last year in terms of understanding how many charging points we have. I believe right now, as of March, we have more than 200,000, but we will need more. And from a various point of view, we will need more than just 1 million charging points by 2025. We feel that the 13 million number here is a little low, and we'll have actually more vehicles on the road by then. And therefore, we're going to need more charging infrastructure and more diverse charging infrastructure by then. So what does the EV market look like today? This is a bit of a complicated kind of overview, but really what I'm trying to explain here is that the market has really developed since 2014. The CPO, charge point operators, that company or that stakeholder that provides actually the charging point infrastructure, the roaming platforms connect both the charging point operator and an e-mobility service provider, people who kind of work in the background. And these are kind of the main players I want to explain here, this CPO, MSP platform, these kind of, let's say, actors who were not as prominent, let's say, back in 2014, and then you have your EV driver. And so looking at the market today, we can see from the CPOs, and again, this is a very comprehensive overview. This is just some brief research that I did. There are many, many more companies in this space than what I have here. Plus, what I've considered to be a typical EMSP or mobility service provider like Iberdrola, they also provide charge points. So it's not a complete and comprehensive overview, but really just this is how complex the market is. Now we have many stakeholders, many industry representatives here, and plus we have a significant amount of roaming platforms as well. So the market is quite complex at this point in 2020. So right now, what are the issues that we find, at least from a value? Roaming with an EV, yes, the original AFID gave us the ability to enter into either a subscription-based contract or an ad hoc. But when we talk about roaming, what I really mean is going from one country to another country. Even though I have that ability to, enter into a contract or not enter into a contract, understanding whether I can charge at another company's charging in, let's say, France from Belgium, is still very opaque. It's possible that a roaming platform exists connecting the charge point operator from Belgium to the charge point operator in France, but I, as a consumer, may not necessarily know that. So it makes it very hard to understand whether I can actually go roam with my electric car, and therefore it gives me anxiety whether I long distances. Further to that is that price transparency. Do I know how much I will have to pay at that charging point in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France? Sometimes you will get an invoice after you charge at that charging point, 3 months later, because they have so many different communication from the charge point operator in France to your current provider in Belgium. And then the payment methods. Sometimes you're able to pay with a bank card, sometimes you're able to pay with your phone, but as many people now know in the market, you could have many applications. You may not be able to pay with your bank card. There are different types like an RFID tag, which is basically a tag that allows you to tap against the charge point, and charging in buildings. And this is more of a private infrastructure issue, but again, what we find from all of our members in the different European member states is that charging in buildings is a huge issue, and yeah, makes the charging infrastructure market quite complex. And then last, the charge point availability and real-time information. In Western Europe, let's say Netherlands, Belgium, France, to an extent, you have companies, applications that allow you to, let's say, see in real time if that charge point is available. But this technology or these applications do not extend. So in going in Central and Eastern Europe, you may not find whether the charge point is available, whether it's functioning, and whether there's somebody actually charging at the current at the charge point at that time. From the business perspective, cost effectiveness is a huge issue. Installing high and ultra fast charging where the network might not be so high in terms of grid capacity makes it very expensive to install charging infrastructure. Public tendering processes, what I mean by this is essentially if a municipality wants to roll out charging infrastructure in a specific neighborhood, in a specific area, they will roll out a tender with specific specifications about what kind of infrastructure they may need. But because the market is quite diverse, their understanding of the market is not as extensive as someone else's, or from an industry point of view. So public tendering might be different from Brussels to Ghent to the Netherlands. So trying to understand that public tendering process for companies can be quite difficult. And then communication protocols. Again, they're very complex, but essentially, I think this picture really illustrates it very well. Is really having the car speak to the charge point, and then the charge point as well speaking to everything in the background. It's basically, sorry, I don't understand. I mean, this is basically explains it quite well from my point of view. And so now the second poll, Philippe. What do you think is the biggest barrier to the mass rollout of charging infrastructure in Europe? Is it availability and accessibility? Is it the fragmented national policies across Europe? Or do we have the financial incentives to really push out infrastructure in places where it's not cost effective? Or is it something else that I have not included?
Answers are coming in. See quite diversity. Just wait a few seconds more. I see also a new question popping up on the Q&A. We will handle these questions at the end of the webinar.
Yeah.
Okay. See, we're still voting. And I will stop the poll now and share you the results.
Oh, it's almost split between fragmented national policies and lack of financial incentives. Other. It would be good to understand what other people think about the other. But yeah, I mean, just to come back to what I was saying about directives and regulations in the beginning, fragmented national policies. This we found was an issue with this original alternative fuels infrastructure directive, is because member states have that ability to implement this EU directive how they see fit within their different national context, creating quite, again, fragmentation. So it's interesting to see that here. Okay, just move on. So what do we want to see in the revised really needs to be changed? First off, changing it to a regulation, again, would eliminate this inconsistent implementation and interpretation across the EU. From stakeholders in Brussels, what we've talked about as well is that this would allow us to go beyond pure public infrastructure and into the private area. So pushing this right to plug. This right to plug is something that stems from France, where if you're in and you want to have your own charging point, you have that right to plug. Nobody can deny you that having a charging point within your building. And we feel that the AFID, as we would now call it, would allow you to push into that domain. We also feel that binding targets for infrastructure for 2025 and 2030 would really help give clarity to the market. And we think revised definitions for both alternative fuels, actually focusing more on zero-emission mobility, more robust definitions of both slow, normal, and fast. As we've seen the market, as this diagram shows, really, the market has advanced so much in the past years that 22 kilowatt hours is not, and above, for instance, it's not fast charging from our point of view. It should at least be 50 kilowatt hours and above, and then we really need to know what fast and ultra fast charging is as well. From our point of view, fast can be anything above 100, and then even you have now 350 kilowatt hours, which could be ultra fast charging. And as well, semi-public charging points needs to be more, I would say, defined within the AFID. in a sense that these charging points that are at an IKEA or a Colruyt that are accessible only part of the time while you do your shopping, these will really help understand the amount of charging points in the market, therefore allowing us to track it better and to get an understanding of where we need more charging infrastructure. So it's again, does help the consumer experience down the line and allows us to understand where we need more charging infrastructure. From the consumer perspective, primarily, we need to enable seamless, interoperable, harmonized, ad hoc, and or subscription-based. From our point of view, at least now in 2020, we cannot get rid of, let's say, ad hoc charging. We need that flexibility in the market still. We can't force people to subscribe to one company or another. So that will still be key for now. And we need to set fair pricing. We need to know, as consumers, am I able to charge what the price for charging is in the moment before I enter into that charging service at that point in time. So if you can show the price by kilowatt hour, and if necessary, extra fees can be transparently provided as well. That, in our view, would be the most optimal. Other ways that are being assessed in the market as this euros, our national currency per 100 kilometer, again, to really understand how for charging. From the business perspective, there are a lot of ways, for instance, to address that communication issue I was talking about before. On the right, you have one of the ways. It's a predominant way of communicating with this OCPI protocol, which really links the back ends of these roaming platforms to the mobility service provider, to the charge point. What we would ideally like to see within this revised piece of legislation is really to set a minimum amount of protocols that allow the different, let's say, communication protocols to interact, so we're not preferring one over another. For tendering processes, we could recommend a streamlined minimum kind of recommendations for what should be included in these tenders. And then lastly, if we can provide funding for non-profitable investments linked to the mandatory targets for EV infrastructure, you then prioritize the rollout of that ultra-fast charging along, let's say, corridors where you really need it. And you ensure that it becomes profitable and a priority to install it. And then smart charging, looking to the future. What we really mean here with smart charging technology is being able to delay or slow or accelerate or postpone even a charging service at a specific period of time. And one example we can really see is that of Amsterdam. This is from our project for City. This is Flex Power in Amsterdam, which essentially allows the charging points, 456 charging stations, to provide less electricity or less amount of power between the hours of 6 and 9 p.m. when charging, for instance, when there's peak demand on the grid. Let's say when everybody is at home trying to do the laundry, cook their food, there's a lot of strain on the electricity grid. And so if you want to charge a massive amount of electric vehicles at that same time, you may put a strain on the grid, you have to upgrade it, which is quite costly. So if at night consumption is low, or during the day when there's a lot of solar power, there's a lot of renewables in the grid at that time, it's more optimal than doing it during the peak hours. And you can also benefit from quicker charging, less expensive charging. And so now we get to our third and final poll. And we've had more questions. What is the key to unlocking full market maturity of the EV infrastructure market? Is it harsh communication protocols, is it consumer infrastructure, or is it rollout of smart charging ready infrastructure?
This is our last poll that we launch in this webinar.
Great to see that there are so many questions as well.
I see quite diversity in the answers, and I think it also is linked to the diversity of our participants. Wait a few seconds more. Thank you for voting, and we'll share the results.
It's consumer friendly.
So it's clear
Okay,
that
so I see again.
Different.
Yeah, it's harmonized and consumer friendly. Charging infrastructure primarily. A key thing to note here is this harmonized communication protocols. And the overarching aspect of why we believe that's key is because it allows friendly charging infrastructure. If we create harmonized protocols across the EU that are easy to and essentially roll out for the European market, it enables consumer-friendly charging infrastructure. So they are kind of linked. But yeah, it's good to see that smart charging ready infrastructure as well was quite important there. And so yes, we've reached the end of my presentation. Let's take a look at the. I will take the first question because it's been upvoted twice. About the communication, cars should provide info on state of charge battery to charging stations so that it can be used by smart charging. What is your view on this? I think from our point of view, this is obviously key aspect of the future of charging. It's not only, to be clear, state of health is not only necessary for smart charging, but vehicle to grid, which is another step in that kind of future of chain. And of course, we are going to need the state of health and the state of charge of the battery to understand, again, for that kind of business model to take off. So I believe that issue will not be specifically handled within the AFID, but it will be handled in other legislations. But we, of course, support getting access to the state of charge. But I believe, yes, this will obviously be a contentious issue, given that the OEMs personally find this information to be proprietary and commercially, just in the same way that CPOs and the MSPs, for instance, find the charging point static and dynamic data to be also commercially sensitive data, information. So again, we find that this will be necessary to obtain, but in a way which is essentially efficient, or to get all the stakeholders on board. Because if we don't, for instance, get the OEMs on board with providing that data or access to that data specifically in a specific period of time, and then it kind of is a barrier to the market if we cannot get access to it. But yes, of course, we support this, and we believe it's key to the development of the market. I would just move down. Do we know how different member states interpret the concept of reasonable prices for ad hoc charging? No, I personally do not know that. But I know we do have one of our hosts who has been looking into that information. The state of charge is already being derived from the charging. Yes, okay, thank you, Flores. But yeah, sorry, do we know the different member states interpret the concept of reasonable prices? From my understanding, no. And I think that's again, interpretation to the member states about this concept of reasonable prices, because I know that even in the UK, when I've been there, I've experienced someone has essentially gone through their phone and told me, look, I've charged for €5 or £5 at this one point at this charge, and then at another time I charged for £20, and it was essentially close to the same amount of charging time and charging speed. So it's I think it's up to interpretation. And again, that's why we need to really set out within this new revision of the AFID to understand that better. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. Do we know what is the average cost today for each of the different charging platforms? Normal, fast, super fast. What is the business case to allow to break even? Again, it varies with charging platforms. If we can, maybe I can go back to the slide where we have the charging platforms.
If I'm allowed, about the charging cost, that topic we're going to handle in the next webinar on related to EAFO. So then we go more in deep through the different member states, what we see in the different pricing platforms and which price structures they will take, also on normal and fast. About business cases, we are not in a position to answer on this, unfortunately.
When will that dynamic, okay, so the next question, what are the next steps in the revision of the AFID? What can we do to be involved? Any consultation plans? So the next steps of the revision of the AFIDs. So as part of the Green Deal, the European Commission set out that they set out a timeline that they would announce their proposal for revision of the AFID in 2021. So the steps leading up to that, they will have to do a public consultation prior to announcing their proposal. And the public consultation is planned for Q1 of 2020. So that's essentially any day now. And how can you be involved? Well, you can join AVERE essentially to become a member of AVERE, and we can align actually on the revision of the AFID and incorporate your positions and your key issues that are important for you on the AFID, and essentially align as an association for electromobility on the AFID. That's at least my point of view. So I'll go to the next question. When will dynamic charging infrastructure be part of AFIDs? I'm not sure I understand what you mean by dynamic charging infrastructure. Philippe, do you understand? So perhaps you can explain your question a bit more in the chat box.
I think dynamic charging will be meaning that there is a price difference, so that people will get pushed forward to charge when the price is changing. So we can go to situations
where I see electric road systems. Yes, that's also obviously something that I really focused on road transport and passenger cars. Of course, the AFID will also have to take a look into heavy duty vehicles and supporting charging infrastructure for those. I don't think they will, let's say, prioritize electric road systems or charging at very fast depot charging, for instance, but they will have to find in some way what they mean our charging infrastructure for heavy duty vehicles. So that will come now within the revision, definitely dynamic charging infrastructure, or let's say this type of style of charging infrastructure. I'm going to move to the next question. Totally agree with the parallel set between dynamic EPOI data on one hand and with the state of charge data on the other hand. One could argue that CPOs are obliged to share the real-time EPOI without OEM being obliged to do with the same, provided the consent of the driver. Yes, that's, again, that's will be key. How do you see the future development of high power charging technology for heavy vehicle range charging above 350 kWh and 2 megawatt range? Essentially, from what I understand from the electric heavy duty vehicle segments, we are going to see the really rapid development in the next 5 to 10 years now. Whether that we'll start to see this kind of, I believe at least there are companies that are developing this type of high power charging. But because commercially right now, there are no electric heavy duty vehicles on the roads commercially available. The majority of them are in kind of project based or these kinds of aspects. We won't see it, at least, for the next in the next 2 years. I would say 3 to 5 years. Really going to see the development of electric heavy duty vehicles.
This will also be linked to the development of the battery technology. Yeah? The better the batteries become, the better they can handle fast charging. The development will be linked of both technologies, both aspects.
Okay, is the new definition of zero emission based on the entire life cycle of the alternative fuel? For us, it's really more if the vehicle has a battery, it's based on if there's a battery in it and it runs on zero emissions, so no tailpipe, so it's not on the entire life cycle. And that's, again, from our point of view, it's not, let's say, something that's being pushed by the European Commission or anyone else. That's from a various point of view, what we need to have as part of the revision of the AFID, that we should focus more on zero emission mobility in general. So yeah, that's something we'll be advocating within the new file. Will a regulation instead of directive potentially take much longer in the EU to come to an agreement? I mean, that it's possible that if we get into the details of discussion of a regulation instead of directive, the threats is that you may have inflation. Some member states will have to make concessions. We may have to give kind of different concessions to different member states because we're ambitious. But we think that with where the market is right now and on these core areas, there's a lot of agreement on, let's say, where the market needs to go. So I think it will be more successful as a regulation rather than if we just settle on it being a directive. I think in any case, the process will take a bit longer because the market is so complex right now, because there's so many different stakeholders. I would say even in the CPOs and EMSP kind of markets, there's not so much, let's say, agreement on some of the details. So in any case, it will take longer than what we originally saw back in 2014. Okay, how will smart charging impact the ability of MSPs/CPOs to provide price transparency if some settlement may take time post-charging for reconciliation? Let me just read that again. That is a good question that I have to be honest, I don't know specifically the answer to. I know already, though, there are smart charging companies like Jetlix that do smart charging already. And I know that from that point of view, you can already do smart charging and settle up. And I don't think it takes necessarily a lot of time for reconciliation to do smart charging specifically. But I can take a look into it and we can get back to you on that. In the new AFID, is there something specific about charging light vehicles? Again, there's nothing currently on the table, so that's something that we can definitely align. And I assume at least there will be something about light vehicles because even back then there wasn't, let's say, extensive amount of light electric vehicles in the market at that time. But I assume from different stakeholders, they will probably push to have that within there. So yeah, there's nothing in it currently though, because there is no, let's say, proposal or even public consultation yet on the table. I will take this second question here. The revised directive should recommend require in some cases support of EVs identifying and authorizing themselves and potentially V2G. Yes, I think it will incorporate identification and support of EVs, including ISO 15118. For those of you who don't know, that's essentially allowing the car to self-identify and the charging point to understand who's driving in the electric car at that time. It's possible that that will happen. It really also depends on the interest as who advocates to have that and put in there. But I know, for instance, ISO 15118, while it does apply to a lot of the vehicles in the market, some, let's say it's not applicable to all, let's say, charging infrastructure in the market sometimes. For instance, CHAdeMO would not be able to use 15118 for their charging infrastructure. So yeah, do we know if the definition of publicly accessible infrastructure will be revised? Yes, we know that it will be revised in the AFID. It will. I mean, that is one of the key topics that everybody seems to rally on as well, that we need to change the definition of public accessible infrastructure and to change the types of definition. For instance, again, from what I was saying about semi-public and versus public infrastructure. So that's how we see it moving in the future. Going to go down. What is your view on prices close to €1 per kilowatt hour? Must we accept that long distance EV traveling is twice as expensive as diesel/gasoline traveling? I would say we take that question within our next webinar, as it is going to deal with also pricing and this stuff.
Okay, Jason, we have answered quite some.
Yeah, I would say we wrap it up. Yes. If your questions were not answered, feel free to shoot me an email, or to get in touch after. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attendance. I hope you are satisfied with this webinar. Thank you, Jason, for this excellent explanation. I would also like to invite you to our upcoming webinars. The AFO pricing of public charging for electric vehicles webinar is next week, also Thursday at 10 o'clock. It's quite close to this topic. So please attend that one as well. Thank you for now and have an excellent day. Keep it safe. Bye.